Why do hockey players fight? What's behind this wild tradition that you won't find in any other sport? Today we're diving into hockey's roughest custom and how it's become part of the game. The connection between hockey and fighting goes back to the very beginning. In fact, the first indoor hockey game ever played, on March 13, 1875 in Montreal, ended with fisticuffs between players and spectators. What's even more fascinating is that early hockey was described as probably more like rugby on skates than modern hockey. The first documented in-game fight happened in 1890, when the Rideau Hall Rebels faced off against the Granite Hockey Club in Toronto. That brawl was so significant, it led to the formation of the Ontario Hockey Association, partly to prevent such incidents from happening again. The early days of hockey fighting were particularly brutal. Players didn't wear protective equipment during fights, and there were few rules governing these encounters. Toronto at the time was predominantly British and Protestant, proud of its fair play at all times credo. But in other parts of Canada, like Kitchener, which was largely German, there was no such mentality. This cultural divide helped shape how fighting evolved in different regions. Ironically, trying to control fighting only seemed to make it more popular. When newspapers would condemn the violence, more fans would show up hoping to see exactly that. As one hockey historian put it, it was like going to see the gladiators. The Toronto media's attempts to paint competing leagues as barbaric only increased public interest in the violence. In those early days, hockey was played with minimal rules and even less enforcement. The sport was naturally physical, fast, and intense, a perfect recipe for heated confrontations. Even deaths couldn't halt fighting's rise in popularity. In 1905, player Alcide Lauren died after being punched and hit with a stick. 2 years later, Owen "Bud" McCourt lost his life after being attacked by several Ottawa Victorias players. Despite these tragic incidents, fighting remained deeply embedded in hockey's DNA. The history of hockey fights includes some legendary moments that have become part of the sport's folklore. Take the infamous Good Friday Massacre in 1984, when the Quebec Nordiques and Montreal Canadiens engaged in two separate bench-clearing brawls before the third period even began. The chaos resulted in 252 penalty minutes and 11 player ejections. Officials had to turn off the arena lights to try to stop the fighting. The punch-up in Piestany in 1987 became another infamous moment, a bench-clearing brawl between Canada and the Soviet Union during the World Junior Championships that lasted 20 minutes and led to both teams being disqualified from the tournament. This fight was particularly dangerous because the Soviet players weren't familiar with North American fighting customs and escalated beyond what was considered acceptable. And then you have goalie fights, which have become rare but are a celebrated spectacle in hockey. Beyond Roy versus Vernon, we've seen memorable matchups like Roy versus Chris Osgood in '98, and a wild 2004 game where Philadelphia's Robert Esche squared off against Ottawa's Patrick Lalime in a game that set the NH world record with 419 penalty minutes. That game ended with 20 players ejected, leaving just 5 players on each team's bench. If you're enjoying this deep dive into hockey history, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any upcoming content. When we talk about hockey fighting, we have to understand the code, the unwritten rules that govern when and how players should fight. It's a complex system of honor and respect that real hockey fighters take seriously. For instance, enforcers typically only fight other enforcers, and they must mutually agree to the fight through a verbal or physical exchange on the ice. It's considered poor form to challenge someone at the end of their shift when they're tired, and you never jump someone who's already hurt. The tactics of hockey fighting have evolved significantly over the decades. Early fighters like Gordie Howe would grab their opponent's sweater near the armpit to restrict their movement. Some fighters just go for it, putting their head down and throwing as many punches as possible as quickly as possible. Rob Ray of the Buffalo Sabres became so notorious for removing his jersey during fights that the NHL created the Rob Ray rule, requiring jerseys to have tie-down straps. Bob Probert of the Detroit Red Wings and Chicago Blackhawks would let his opponents tire themselves out before taking control of the fight. Fighting specialists have to be strategic about maintaining balance on the ice while throwing punches, which is why most fighters keep one hand firmly gripped on their opponent's jerseys. They also have to be mindful of the third man in rule, which automatically ejects any player who joins an existing fight, and the instigator rule, which adds an extra 2-minute penalty to whoever starts the fight. During the NHL's original 6 era, from 42 to 67, nearly every player had to be tough enough to look after himself. Even the game's biggest stars like Maurice Rocket Richard and Gordie Howe were known to drop the gloves when necessary. The story of Howe defeating notorious tough guy Lou Fontinato, breaking his nose in the process, actually helped to establish Howe's reputation and gave him more space on the ice to score goals. But everything changed with the NHL's expansion in '67. As the league grew from 6 teams to 12 and eventually to 32, the role of the enforcer emerged. Teams began employing players whose primary job was to protect their stars and intimidate opponents. Wayne Gretzky, for instance, had a succession of protectors, including Dave Semenko and Marty McSorley. Brett Hull was protected by Kelly Chase. This led to the rise of the Broad Street Bullies, the Philadelphia Flyers teams of the '70s that made intimidation central to their strategy. The enforcer era reached its peak in the '80s, when fights occurred in nearly every game. Legendary enforcers like Dave Tiger Williams, Bob Probert, and Ty Domi became fan favorites. Former enforcer Troy Crowder, who famously fought Probert 3 times in '90 to '91, provides fascinating insight into the enforcer mentality. He hated being sent out just to change momentum and wanted to be known as more than just a fighter. Some enforcers even began training specifically for fighting rather than overall hockey skills, a trend that concerned many hockey purists. Today's NHL has evolved, but fighting hasn't disappeared, it's just changed. Modern enforcers like Ryan Reeves and Pat Maroon combine toughness with actual hockey skill. They can score goals and make plays while still maintaining the traditional enforcer role. This new breed of tough guys shows how the role is adapted to the faster and more skilled modern game. By the 2014-15 season, fights had dropped to just 0.32 per game, compared to nearly 1 fight per game in the '80s. But with this evolution comes serious concerns about player safety. The tragic deaths of enforcers Wade Belak, Rick Rippon, and Derek Boogaard in 2011 forced the hockey world to confront the darker side of fighting. Boogaard was posthumously diagnosed with CTE, a degenerative brain disease caused by repeated head trauma. Other former enforcers like Bob Probert were also found to have CTE after their deaths. The mental toll of being an enforcer is particularly concerning. Kelly Chase, who accumulated over 2,000 penalty minutes in his career, described how enforcers would have to deal with pre-fight anxiety, knowing days in advance they would have to fight specific opponents. Stu Grimson, nicknamed the Grim Reaper, had his career ended by post-concussion syndrome and became an advocate for better concussion protocols. Medical research has increasingly linked repeated blows to the head, whether from fighting or other hockey impacts, to long-term brain damage. While the NHL has taken steps to reduce head injuries from blindside hits, critics argue that the league hasn't done enough to address brain trauma that can result from fighting. The first known death directly related to a hockey fight occurred in 2009, when Don Sanderson of the Whitby Dunlops died after his head hit the ice during a fight. Hey, before we continue with the modern debate over fighting, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell to stay updated on all of our future videos. The medical community has been increasingly vocal about the dangers of fighting. The Canadian Academy of Sports Medicine stated that fighting does cause injuries, which range from fractures of the hands and face to lacerations and eye injuries. They called it an endemic and ritualized blot on the reputation of the North American game. Some team doctors have started speaking out about the cumulative effect of repeated head trauma, especially for players who fight frequently. Yet, despite these concerns, fighting remains part of hockey's culture. While some critics argue it's a dangerous relic that should be banned, others maintain it's an essential part of the game's self-policing nature. Former enforcers like Kelly Chase argue that today's NHL is actually more dangerous without fighting, as players are more likely to take liberties with dirty hits when they don't fear immediate consequences. The statistics on fighting's effectiveness are mixed. Since the 79 to 80 season, teams in the bottom 3 of fighting-related major penalties have finished at the top of the regular season standings 10 times and have won the Stanley Cup 11 times. Meanwhile, teams in the top 3 have won the regular season and Stanley Cup only twice each. One analysis suggests that winning a fight benefits a team by about 1/80th of a win in the standings. While European leagues and the Olympics ban fighting outright, the NHL continues to regulate it through rules like the third man in and the instigator rule. Even as legends like Wayne Gretzky call for its end, NHL Commissioner Gary Bettman maintains that fighting has always had a role in the game. Love it or hate it, fighting has shaped hockey's identity for over a century. While its future may be uncertain, its legacy is undeniable. But what do you think? Should fighting stay or go in the NHL? Let us know in the comments down below. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any upcoming videos. Until then, go ahead and click on one of these videos here to keep watching, and I'll see you in the next one.